The former Premier of Alberta is weighing in on the concerns about Western alienation and the threats of separation in Alberta. Rachel Notley is, of course, still the leader of the official opposition in Alberta, the NDP, and says she'll make another run for the Premier's job in the next provincial election. Rachel Notley joins me now. Good to see you.
Good to be here.
Thanks for coming to speak with me. You made a speech at Carleton University in Ottawa last night. Got it here, read it. The title was The Perfect Storm, simultaneously addressing the goals of supporting Alberta oil and gas industry and combating climate change in an age of economic slowdown, political polarization, and Indigenous reconciliation. So let's start there. That title alone would give a lot of people ample reason for pessimism about the state of the nation, but not you. Why not?
Well, I mean, I do think that as a nation, we have what it takes to navigate these really tough waters. But I think that we have to be working very hard to listen to each other, to hear each other, and understand that there's tremendous levels of complexity, and that there are very different perspectives in different parts of the country, and that you know, we're just going to have to work through it. And what we have to do is go from that initial position of saying, here's what I think. No, you're wrong, here's what I think, and move past it to, okay, so great, but what's the solution here?
But with respect, I mean, politicians have been saying that for a long time about, well, maybe not that long of a time, because it seems to me, having followed this for a long time, we're at kind of a different place than where we've been in the last number of years with the sort of intransigence, difficulty moving forward. We have the Prime Minister calling for consensus. We have a lot of people calling for consensus, and we need to hear each other, and yet nobody seems to want to abandon the positions they hold. And how big of a challenge is that?
Well, it is a challenge because I do think that we've got a number of different things that are all coming together at the same time, and so that is difficult. And you know, speaking from the perspective of an Albertan, I mean, we really do have a generational restructuring of the oil and gas industry, which is the single biggest driver of economic activity in Alberta, and quite frankly, large swaths of the whole country. And this is not a short-term thing. This is a major restructure, and so it's creating uncertainty and fear and anxiety, and so this is a huge thing. And then to try and deal with that at the same time that we're trying to deal with the very real challenges that the international investment community is demanding that we address with respect to climate change, and this overlay of Indigenous reconciliation. I mean, these are all each one of these could be a generational challenge, and they're all coming together at the same time.
Let's drill down on some of it. Unemployment in Alberta now running at about 7%, 50,000 full-time jobs lost since last June. The Premier, Jason Kenney, largely, I can say, is blaming the policies of the federal government and inaction on things such as, you know, rail blockades for scaring away investors. And let me hear, you touched on it, but let me hear more from you on that, about why you think big energy projects such as Tech Frontier are deciding to pull the plug.
Well, because again, what we have is a generational issue with respect to the need to take meaningful action to combat climate change, and that's a big challenge, and it requires a whole bunch of policy heavy lifting. And in my view, we were on the path to getting that work done. It wasn't perfect. We hadn't finished all the work, but we had put in place a framework, and by we I mean our government in Alberta, and we were tying into what was happening across the rest of the country, and we were on the way to creating the kind of certainty that international investors needed, including key investors in the oil and gas industry, who were quite frankly at the table in 2015 with our government when we first developed the Climate Leadership Plan. You know, then you know, Jason Kenney decided to make that a political issue, and the first thing he did after he got elected was he ripped it up, and that has created a great deal more uncertainty. And that doesn't negate some of the points, quite frankly, that Jason Kenney and even I made when I was Premier about the other levels of uncertainty that exist, for instance, in terms of how do you navigate the construction of a pipeline while we are also dealing with the evolving status of Indigenous rights. How do we do that? But to simplify it, the way Jason Kenney is doing to demonize the federal government, to say that's the only reason why we can't get this done. I mean, it's just not. We're not going to get to solutions if we continue to identify simplistic answers to complicated problems.
And you make the case that people had better pay closer attention to what's actually happening in the marketplace. It's no longer it's no longer a political battle about developing resources and governments versus governments. And I guess it circles us back to the conversation around the need for a proper climate change framework that industry can look at and everybody can buy into and accept. And that's this idea that, look, the investors are walking away from it. The investors are saying, I can't get certainty, and maybe there's questions around value and so on. But do you think that part of the piece is still being ignored to a certain extent in Alberta? That look at what industry is saying and doing as opposed to what politicians are saying and doing.
Right, absolutely, because you even saw the head of the Calgary Chamber of Commerce essentially replicating the advice and the call that we saw from the CEO of Tech, saying, listen, let's get it together. Let's stop demonizing folks who argue that we need to take real action on climate change, and let's sit down and find a framework that we can all agree is something that we can work within. And so what's happened is the argument, the work had sort of moved 3 steps down the path, and then and maybe we still have another 2. But meanwhile, what's happened is Jason Kenney's pulled us right back to the very beginning of that path, and so we're wasting time. Is the key issue, and that's the message that's being delivered. Whether it's BlackRock Investments, whether it's the CEO of Tech, whether it's Mark Carney, whether it's the Calgary Chamber of Commerce. I mean, they're all delivering that message, and now we're scrambling to play catch up.
Let's talk about the anger in Alberta and the threats of separation. It's an anger based in, and you talked about some of this in your speech last night, an anger based in this feeling of neglect by the rest of Canada, based on the fact that Alberta's fiscal contributions to the Federation far outweigh any other provinces, and yet Albertans feel that they're being shortchanged in the way they're treated. Do you believe that anger is justified, and in fact, do you share it?
I certainly don't share any kind of anger that would ever lead me to ever suggest that separation is a thing that we should be talking about. Sometimes there is frustration, but I think what we're really seeing in Alberta and what's driving this the most is the genuine fear and uncertainty that comes from what I described before, which is the restructuring of our oil and gas industry, and a lot of folks wondering if they're ever going to have the kind of economic security that they once had and have grown used to, and so that that makes people fearful. It makes them fearful for their kids. It makes them fearful for their retirement. It makes them fearful for next week. And when you're in that headspace, anger is a natural result, and then there's layers on top of it. Do Albertans see the rest of the country as fully understanding what's going on in Alberta, and or understand what it actually means for the rest of the country as well? And this is the point that I've always tried to make, that frankly the rest of the country needs Alberta to do well for the rest of the country to do well.
Right.
But nonetheless, so there is anger, and then and yes, there is frustration with how the Federation has failed to move quickly enough in terms of supporting Alberta's desires to take a path that will get us to more prosperity. But honestly, that's not the only piece. What's happening, though, is that it has been amplified, I would say, well beyond what it needs to be. And then so we've created, or not we, but the current government has created this very, very divisive, polarized East-West thing, which, again, ignores all the issues. It focuses on one and ignores all many
as
of
you
the
know,
others.
for Alberta Conservative MPs have put out the Buffalo Declaration,
Right.
which talks about this unity crisis and the lack of respect for Alberta and economic inequality, and talking about the possibility of Albertans seeking independence. So you don't support that declaration, obviously, but why isn't that? Why do you think that's not a legitimate tool, or at least not a healthy tool? If that if that process were to move forward and Albertans were to sign on with that, wouldn't that be a reflection of how Albertans really feel?
Well, because I think Albertans, the majority of Albertans are much smarter than the authors of the Buffalo Declaration, and they understand that the economic uncertainty that that kind of discussion creates, the loss of certainty around their pension rights that those kinds of things would create, the extra costs associated with having our own police force, and the ridiculous notion that somehow we're going to get more access to new markets by negotiating with jurisdictions that we're now not part of the same, that aren't part of the same country that we're in. I mean, all of that makes very little sense. And some people say, oh no, this is just part of a very elaborate game of poker with the federal government. Come on. I mean, that's just childish and it's silly and that particular argument. Albertans want Alberta or Ottawa to come to the table with us, absolutely. But this idea, some of the ideas that are in this Buffalo Declaration and the things that they're pushing, like the CPP, like collecting our own taxes, all these things. Right. These things were considered and rejected 2 decades ago as being costly or undoable. And this idea that we're going to somehow go in and rewrite the Constitution and rewrite and eliminate equalization. I mean, also, like, let's talk about practical solutions, deliverable solutions, not talking points.
Let's talk about that. So let's finish on this. We've got a federal budget coming up shortly.
Exactly.
So that's an opportunity, one would think, for the federal government to demonstrate, to put some action behind the words we've heard, that they feel Alberta's pain. Alberta, we got your back. What does that look like in a budget then? What do you need to see in a budget?
Right. Well, honestly, the call for a redo on the Fiscal Stabilization Fund is not something that originated with the Jason Kenney's government. We made the same call. When Jason Kenney and Stephen Harper were running the federal government, they didn't change the cap on the Fiscal Stabilization Fund. And the last time the matter came up, neither did the Trudeau government. And I think that this is a time where that needs to be reconsidered. And so we'd certainly like to see more support through a revision of the Fiscal Stabilization Fund and certainly going back. So that's one thing. I mean, I think there's other things that can be done, more infrastructure investment, more support in terms of job creation, capital investment to help us through the current struggle that we're with. And we all know that some of the most immediate things that we're dealing with in Alberta now or across the country will negatively impact Alberta even more. So we certainly need that recognition in the budget, and I certainly hope that we'll see it.
All right, Rachel Notley, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.